We're 6 months into this pandemic, and what we're seeing is that it's really something that's unprecedented. We've seen huge drops in consumer spending, which in turn has impacted small businesses, which in turn has impacted employment. It's really unique in the sense that it doesn't look like previous recessions. When we look at who's been hit hardest, one thing we see is that consumer spending has dropped precipitously, especially right after COVID cases started going up in early March. But something we saw is that the drop in consumer spending was most extreme with high-income individuals. So it was high-income families who really stopped spending. And in part, this is because high-income families can self-isolate, they can work remotely, and they're the ones who are really not going to their local restaurants, local bars, and local small businesses. Usually these higher income communities are somewhat buffered from these economic shocks. But in this case, it's actually those low-income workers who are working in these high-income communities who are facing the biggest brunt of this crisis. So for example, I'm in New York now. If you were a low-income worker and you were working in a restaurant or bar in Manhattan, a very high-income community, there was a 70% chance that you lost your job. Whereas if you're working in the Bronx, somewhat lower-income community, a similar low-income worker working in a bar restaurant in that neighborhood only had a 30% chance of losing their job. So workers are getting hit across the board, but in this case, they're being hit especially hard in some of these higher income communities. At Opportunity Insights, we specialize in big data. And so we're able to measure the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis using private sector information. The data really shows us that we need to support those families and individuals that have been hit hardest by this crisis, right? So those families that have lost their jobs, especially focusing on expanding unemployment insurance and really providing those supports to those folks who are losing dollars every day because they aren't able to go to work. Something else we're seeing besides the employment impacts are impacts on education. We're seeing that once schools shut down, that low-income families and low-income communities were being hit hardest. Families and children in those communities had the highest levels of drop-off in terms of student engagement and student progress. So we really need to be focusing on those most vulnerable families and those most vulnerable communities. The economy, consumer spending, and these economic trends are really being driven by concerns around the public health crisis. If we really want to move into real recovery, we have to deal with the virus head-on, and until we deal with the public health crisis, the economy is not going to rebound fully.